of high accuracy and certainty are constructed by investigating testing in machine learning. Tests are one important way how the adoption of algorithms is justified. There have been an avalanche of grandiose claims around the accuracy of algorithms in the AI. For example, a team at IBM argued to be able to predict with 95% accuracy which workers will quit in the future. A new research project claimed to be able to detect lies in border control with 75% accuracy, and researchers claim to be able to predict sexual orientation from face images with 91% accuracy. I aim to unpack this situation and continue the project of a sociology of testing in the realms of machine learning. With the current hype around generative AI like ChatGPT, which is claimed to be a sort of universal model due to its complexity, inscrutability, and all-encompassing data, testing to show capabilities and accuracy is again receiving a lot of attention. The clicker seems to be not working. Thanks. Then I will say just next slide. Okay. Yeah, that's the correct one. So, okay, no, the next slide, please. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. Accuracy in machine learning, simply put, refers to a metric that quantifies a correlation between the results of an algorithm and test data. This definition highlights how accuracy is not some absolute universal, but instead depends on chosen test data and perspective. Naming a metric accuracy can already be considered an act of power, as it suggests situated functionality can be expressed with a singular number. This confusing naming in machine learning has led to false descriptions of certainty. For example, the Air Force reportedly developed a missile recognition system that after initial tests was believed to have an accuracy of 90%, but it was tested only with images that contained one missile. Another test later with pictures of multiple missiles revealed a much lower accuracy of 25%. Major General Daniel Simpson described the system as being confidently wrong. Researchers have in the last years highlighted how such accuracy numbers can misinform about functionality and hide problematic effects, arguing even that ML is experiencing a reproducibility crisis. Their work has challenged this avalanche of grandiose claims and deconstructed assumed universal accuracy. Next slide. Yet accuracy metrics still remain important. In part, this is due to how they are needed for developing machine learning algorithms, as they give direction and provide a sense of the capabilities of otherwise opaque, highly complex algorithms. They are meant to be scientific, formal, and standardized quantifications of quality and progress. But on the other hand, they also are performative, normative, and rhetorical numbers circulated to convince others that an algorithm works. The tests influence discourse around accuracy as they are tied to a promise of mechanical objectivity. I argue this duality marks a conflict of interest when those that conduct the test also benefit from favorable results. In the paper, I also discuss in more detail how the circulation of seemingly ever-increasing accuracy numbers on ever bigger data sets within the field and industry enable the performance of continuous scientific progress worthy of investment and attention. Next slide. I draw on ignorance study as a framework to theorize these current issues around unreliability, conflicts of interest, and politics in testing, illustrating how the construction of high accuracy claims also entails the production of ignorance. I argue that the often opaque flexibility in testing and the concealment of human judgment enable the construction of high accuracy claims, and thereby produced accuracy is not, ignorance is not necessarily problematic, but it is always political, imbued with power and productive, as its circulation entails world-making and can engender epistemic violence. Various prior works have highlighted how high accuracy claims have been used to justify and objectify systems of oppression. Next slide, please. I also understand this ignorance as strategic, since the current dominant paradigm in ML incentivizes reporting ever higher accuracy to stay relevant and convince others. This tendency to overpromise has been identified as part of the reproducibility crisis in other fields and also critiqued within the tech industry. The produced ignorance should in turn not be understood as a mere bug, mistake, or a result of pitfalls, but as a feature from which some actors benefit. The current incentives encourage actors to not conduct and even impede investigations into harms and failures to avoid controversy and liabilities while claiming innocence. For example, Meta reportedly asked employees to avoid terms such as discrimination when talking about the algorithms to avoid liability. Various companies also removed employees highlighting risks of key technologies. These strategies are reminiscent of tactics used by controversial companies with a high concentration of market power, such as big oil or big tobacco. In the paper, I highlight several of these tactics and how big tech companies have employed them recently. For example, ShotSpotter advertised its systems for its accuracy, but experts highlighted that they must have excluded test cases for which it was unclear whether a shot had been fired after police arrived to achieve such accuracy numbers. Chicago's Inspector General even noted that physical evidence of a gunshot was found in only 9% of all ShotSpotter alerts, which only further suggests that ShotSpotter is likely misrepresenting the capabilities of its system by choosing what data to consider when calculating accuracy. Next slide. I will now explain several ways how high accuracy claims in machine learning are constructed in testing by producing ignorance. I will illustrate this by unpacking testing for emotion recognition algorithms trained on pictures with a few categories, emotion categories. In the paper, I mention also several additional ways of producing ignorance in testing. Producing ignorance is unavoidable in testing, as it's not possible to test for every eventuality. So a central question of testing is thus about how priorities and perspectives are considered. Next slide. In order to enable high accuracy, like the underlying data, the underlying data needs to be comprised of many stable and recognizable patterns. One central job of engineers is to scope problem spaces and data so they encompass predictable phenomena while excluding those that are unpredictable, messy, or resistant to measurement. This practice of exclusion and simplification is essential for enabling high accuracy in algorithms and making such systems useful, but it's also a political practice. There are several accepted ways practitioners justify such scoping, for instance, by excluding certain examples as outliers. Such exclusions can also be made intentionally in obfuscated ways, but often they are just unnoticed. For instance, because a certain way of framing a problem is considered hegemonic. In the case of emotion recognition, the appearance of high accuracy is made possible by corresponding standard facial by a focus on a few widely recognizable stable emotion categories and corresponding standard facial expressions. Yet, as previous work has highlighted, facial expressions don't necessarily correspond to actual inner emotions, and experiences of emotion cannot be fully captured by decontextualized categories. The high accuracy is thereby enabled by the production of ignorance of the messiness of emotions. Next slide. The predictability that enables calculated high accuracy is also not just out there, but made, for example, for rules, culture, material constraints. They can stabilize patterns that algorithms recognize as correlations. Algorithms, when deployed, can also co-produce predictability by intervening in the world and influencing different actors. For example, this means emotional expressions are somewhat predictable also because they are learned as part of membership in a culture. Testing produces ignorance by not revealing how emotions and culture could be otherwise. Next slide. It is usually not possible to measure constructs directly, so proxies are used instead. If a proxy is accepted, depends on whether it is seen as similar enough to a construct. For example, a consistent classification scheme mapping facial expressions to several widely recognized emotions can be created with high accuracy. So researchers and technologists advocating for emotion recognition can, by convincing others that a proxy is equal to the constructs, create the appearance of highly accurate emotion recognition. In the paper, I describe several rhetorical moves used to do this, like build on a folk belief that emotions can be read from faces, and pointing to macro expressions only visible to algorithms and therefore difficult to challenge. Next slide. The optimization logic in machine learning entails that during training, majority perspectives are learned since they maximize overall accuracy. In turn, minoritized perspectives or test cases have only little impact on accuracy numbers and are often neglected in favor of majorities. This is an intended behavior to make algorithms work for majorities, while less visible minoritized perspectives can be ignored. For example, this means that minoritized expressions of emotion in test data are ignored, while overall accuracy is seemingly not much affected because this only includes a few test cases. Next slide, please. In the paper, I discuss several recommendations for how to deal with issues in testing. I argue practitioners should focus on careful naming, for example, by renaming the accuracy metric test correlation to highlight it does not represent some universal notion of accuracy, but actually a correlation based on a constructed test. I argue to develop different conceptions of accuracy that are more participatory, justice-focused, challenge power, humble, and seamful. This would require embracing feminist sensibilities such as situatedness, local knowledges, and also encourage more qualitative and deeper data and research. I also discuss how optimization algorithms often produce singular results, thereby reproducing one perspective, and argue instead that plurality and activity should be explored more, similar to simulation. Finally, I also argue for more social studies of accuracy that seek to unpack what understandings of accuracy are held by whom and how they are co-produced and stabilized, and what their politics are. Finally, I want to end this talk with a short reflection on current regulatory trajectories. The EU AI Act, for example, proposes a technocratic agency that tests algorithms and AI for safety. But this problematically depoliticizes testing and puts it in the hand of agencies already accused of being captured by interests of big tech companies. I think more testing can improve this current situation, but it also comes with various challenges, like who decides what testing is needed and when it is enough? How can misrepresentation be recognized? How can testing be done to enable more democratic oversight? Beyond these approaches, situating problems within the technology and its uses, more structural changes are also important, as it's unlikely that the market or the scientific process by itself will fix these issues. Current incentive structures and dependencies make it difficult for practitioners to not participate in the hype. Speaking up can result in stigmatization and exclusion, as people are framed as naysayers. The high overlap and interconnection of industry and academia make machine learning unique in contrast to other areas that face similar issues around corporate pressure, like environmental science. In turn, it is important to create more opportunities for independent, multidisciplinary work by introducing taxation for tech companies, improving labor standards, and supporting whistleblowers that point to these issues. Next slide. Yeah. Next slide, please. Yeah. Okay. Thanks for your time. Preprint is available in this oral, and yeah, there's currently a labor strike going on at the University of Michigan of graduate students and instructors, and I want to express my solidarity to that. Thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Next up, we're really lucky to have Kadija Ferryman and Odia Kane from Hopkins talking to us in a really amazing paper on interrogating algorithmic accounts in medical AI.
Great, thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Okay, and I just want to check that. Yes, it works. Okay, great. So I want to just thank the organizers for having us today. We're really excited to be here, and we just want to say that being here has special resonances for both Odia and myself. Odia grew up in New Haven. So this is, special for her to be here. I also went to Yale as an undergrad. So it's nice this is kind of I've been back, obviously, or not obviously, but I've been back since graduation, but this is my first time presenting here as a scholar rather than a student. And also I worked here at the Yale Law School as an undergraduate. I was a circulation assistant at the law library. So it's nice to be here in this capacity today. One thing we don't sort of have in our slide, but I just wanted to make a note of is acknowledge the lands of the indigenous, the various indigenous tribes of Connecticut. There are a number, including the Mohegan, Pequot, Niantic, Quinnipiac. And again, for me as a student, these were names that I had seen, but did not really sort of know the history. So it's really important, I think, to just make those acknowledgements before we begin. Okay. So just a couple of disclosures before we start. So for me, I serve on the National Review Board for the All of Us Research Program, and I'm also a member of the Digital Ethics Advisory Panel for Merck Germany. And Odia has no disclosures to disclose. All right, and so we are going to focus on, the focus of our work is health equity of our research is health equity in medical AI, with a specific focus on medical device regulation by the Food and Drug Administration. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But if you didn't know that, the Food and Drug Administration is the federal agency that's responsible for regulating software that's used as software that's used in medicine, and including medical AI. And today, what we want to sort of some of the threads of that work that we want to bring together are sort of a focus on thinking about health equity alongside algorithmic bias, and discrimination in medical AI. And we hope that some of those threads, will bring those together in the presentation, and that they'll come out in the discussion. So just a little overview of the research study that we conducted, that our paper draws on. It's the Advancing Health Equity in AI and Machine Learning Health Regulation and Policy Study. This was a 10-month exploratory study funded by the Pew Charitable Trust. Thank you, Pew. And it included a couple of aims. So we did a content analysis of publicly available FDA clearance and approval documents of medical AI. We also did a national landscape analysis of sort of organizations working at the intersection of health equity and AI. And we also did qualitative interviews with key stakeholders, again, at this intersection of health equity and AI policy, such as national minority health organizations, national medical organizations, device manufacturers, and scholars who research at this area, at this intersection. So before we kind of delve in, I just want to give a brief overview of the way that the FDA has regulated medical AI. So the history of this sort of, and this is not the kind of full history, right? These are some key moments. So we can start one place to start, even though we can see sort of threads of this earlier, but one place to start that we'll start for today is in 2014, the International Medical Device Regulators Forum issued guidance on how to sort of think about software as a medical device. So as you can imagine, right, and as many people in this room know, software has been around for decades, and there was this move in 2014 to make a distinction between software that was part of medical devices, right, that were in software that was used in hardware devices, to software that was independently acting as a medical device, right? So in 2014, there was this explanation by this international body to say, this is how we define an independent software that's acting as a medical device, not software in a medical device. And then in 2017, the FDA adopted this international sort of definition as their own as well, and also announced this pre-certification program where this was sort of one major step in thinking about how to regulate these independent software medical devices. And it was this experiment essentially to think about regulating the companies rather than the devices themselves. And this was pretty significant divergence from the way the FDA had been regulating medical devices before, right? Thinking about regulating the companies to actually thinking about moving from regulating the devices to regulating the companies. And then in the last couple of years, the agency has released several policy guidance documents. And in relation to what we heard just now, there were, some cases very recently. The University of Michigan, actually, researchers there showed that an algorithm that had been approved and had a certain level of accuracy, that once it was actually being implemented clinically, its accuracy level sort of went down. And so just recently in September of 2022, the agency sort of issued updated guidance on clinical decision support software and how to think about those. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Odia.
Thank you. So just to level set further in terms of talking about policy at the FDA's level, it's important to consider what the FDA does not regulate for the context of this conversation. So the first is this concept of homegrown AI/ML devices. So these would be tools that are developed within a hospital, within a clinical setting, to do a set of tasks, whatever those tasks may be, but they are insulated to that institution or set of institutions within a partnership. The second would be software technologies that have an administrative function. So these would be algorithms that are used for putting calendars together, for example, or some other metric that might be used, if like speech to text, for example. And then the third one would be software technologies that provide lists of recommendations to clinicians, but don't diagnose in any particular way. So this would be a patient that would come in with flu-like symptoms, and then there would be an output that might suggest what kinds of treatment options would be best for that patient. So with that in the background, we're talking about a specific set of medical AI that tend to have more sophisticated, more complicated, and often riskier implications when they're used in healthcare. So I just want to take some time to focus a little bit on our aim 1, which was a content analysis of these FDA summaries. And to use this, we used a medical AI database that had 141 FDA approved devices that were recorded in there. And the focus of our research, as Kadija mentioned earlier, is on health equity. So we wanted to focus on the devices that collected and reported on demographic information that they took on the people used in their sample. And of the 141 devices, we saw initially that only 16 of them even collected and reported on demographic information. So we don't know the demographic makeup per se of these 16 different devices, but we do know that they reported on it. Well, the other 130 almost did not. And within that, you'll see that there's huge variability in the figure in the top. Well, my left view, right, where you can see breaking down by demographic types what were included. And as you can see here, gender data is most consistently included within different devices, and it's not universally, as well as race data is way less frequently found compared to age to data related to age. So we saw a ton of variability in the demographic information that was collected, but also in the way that the performance testing was conducted. So some of them had multi-site phasing, some had different phases where they would go and have a more iterative process to testing the performance of their algorithms. Others had simulated users, some used actual patients and participants to do their research to see how well their algorithms were working. And those weren't consistent between 2 different devices. So then moving on to the main points of the paper that we submitted to the conference, we talk about these 3 key concepts that we want to break down. And apologies if this is repetitive based on your background. This is for audience members who might have diverse introductions to computer science. Kadija and I are not computer scientists, so we were introduced to these concepts through this research. So the first is ground truth, which was referred to a little bit in the past speakers the past panel as well, which is this baseline or reference to which results from experiments and tests are compared. So this is, can your algorithm do what you say it's going to do? And as I just mentioned, there's a lot of variability in what that even means and where this information is coming from. And briefly, we'll give an example of a ground truth. The second is epistemic authority. So these are the ways in which, and applied to artificial intelligence, the ways in which AI tools are established as bearers of knowledge in a particular domain. Many times the AI that we focus on in this paper, they have a specific task that they're trying to complete. So how do we know that we can trust this output and giving the AI the authority to actually be entrusted with their conclusions? And then this third notion of accountability from Neeland, a paper in 2016 that was cited, and accountability having these dual meanings, which is first being open to review of something, and the second is to be able to give an account or an explanation of something and applying these standards to how we view medical AI. And passing over back to Kadija.
Thanks. So we wanted to, so again, just to sort of reframe our paper's points, what we're trying to sort of think about analytically is the way that ground truth is represented in these review documents submitted to the FDA, right? And in all of the documents that we reviewed, there is a performance testing section, right? So this is one of the things that medical AI developers, in order to, have their device approved or cleared by the FDA, they have to show evidence of some kind of performance testing, right? They have to show that their medical AI does what it says it does. And in that section of performance testing, there is a description of the ground truth that was used to test the performance of that medical AI. And so this is where we are really trying to focus our argument for this particular paper and our work going forward, is sort of how that ground truth establishes the epistemic authority of the medical AI within this context of FDA approval or clearance, right? As well as how that ground truth, in addition to sort of establishing the epistemic authority, also provides an account of how the algorithm is sort of seeing the world. So just very quickly, the example that we use, the one example that we focus on in the paper is a triage medical device, and it alerts clinicians, it reads images, and it alerts clinicians about an abnormality in a set of images and triages those images for clinicians to review. And when we looked at the ground truth and the performance testing for that device, the ground truth was established by 3 radiologists, right? And the accuracy of the algorithm was based on the agreement of 2 out of those 3 radiologists, right? And so we just wanted to sort of complicate and bring up that notion of sort of like who is establishing the ground truth, right? And what does that say about expertise and the value of expertise in medical AI? And the other sort of issue as well is that this was just one example of a kind of ground truth. And then just very quickly, very quickly, 2 of the points that we came away with is that, medical AI developers establish ground truth in different ways. It's critical to establishing the epistemic authority, and that this issue of sort of the variability of ground truth, we're thinking about it as an opportunity and a challenge for the FDA's governance in this area, right? And so we think about how aspects of ground truthing in this domain should be more transparent and subject to review, and that there should be an examination of standards of the reference databases and things like that that are used for the literature. And then we just have a couple of questions, but I think we're out of time, and they're in the paper as well. So I think we'll just end there. So thanks.
Okay, I believe our next paper is on Zoom. Is that good? So the next paper, while we're getting it up, is from Kushang Mishra of IIIT Bangalore, and Bidisha Choudhary also of IIIT Bangalore. And the subject is data-driven precision versus farmers' guesswork: how data is remaking agriculture in India.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction, Matthew. My name is Kushang Mishra. I'm a research associate at IIIT Bangalore, and I wrote this paper as part of the humanizing automation project at IIIT Bangalore, along with my supervisor, Professor Bidisha Choudhary, where essentially in this project we are looking at the impact of automation, AI, and machine learning, specifically in the agriculture sector. Yeah. So yes. So I will start by giving a brief background of this paper in the introduction, and then I will provide the state of the art on the current literature on this subject. And then I will talk about the methods we used, followed by our findings, and finally analysis and conclusion. As you can see in the slide, there is a sorting and grading machine over here, which uses AI and machine learning to sort and grade onions into various qualities. So it is going up by the conveyor belt, and it is being sorted into various categories over here. Yeah. So in the next slide, as you can see, data-driven or precision farming is essentially the introduction of AI and machine learning in farming, and it has been adopted in the countries in the global north, and it is being pushed by both the state as well as Silicon Valley companies and private sector as well. Obviously, it portrays a very revolutionary technology. And it portrays it especially in the context of climate change, which the narrative is that It is hampering our ability to grow food. The population is rising. The input prices for the farmers are rising. And so we need the data-driven precision. We need data from the soil, the climate, the water, to essentially, make precise and data-driven decisions. And these are proposed in opposite to the traditional knowledge and skills of the farmers, which are no longer considered in this narrative relevant enough now. Now, as you can see in this image of the farmer, which looks at how farming is envisioned, how the present of the farming is the farmer is confused, but the future of farming is informed by data insights, and how the farmer is able to now make better decisions because of data. So this is the kind of narrative which is being pushed by agri-tech companies as well as by states in many other global north countries. Yeah, so the existing literature on the impact of digital agriculture, essentially, which critiques this essentially from the STS, and it basically critiques this narrative of revolution, which devalues the farmer and put them in the hands of the private companies. And the critique is that it doesn't bring any systematic transformation, but is merely a technological fix to a highly complex social and economic problem in the farming. There is also a critique of the datafication of the farm and how it essentially hides the human infrastructure, which essentially ensures that the operation runs smoothly. Yeah, a sec. Yeah. Now, the problem with the literature right now is that these are focused on the global north. These technologies are now also coming in countries in the global south, like India, and these countries have their own colonial and post-colonial context. Now, as you can see in this image, before that, in the colonial times, the narrative which was pushed by the British was that essentially that we need superior scientific knowledge over the ignorance and inertia of India's agricultural classes, and then how science can essentially increase the yield for the empire to grow. A similar narrative post-independence was pushed when in the post-colonial times by the American state during the Green Revolution, and foundations like Ford Foundation played a crucial role, and then U.S. universities played a crucial role in setting up an infrastructure of agriculture in the country, which essentially pushed for scientific knowledge and technology over the local knowledge and skills of the farmers and the local agricultural practices. As you can see over here, this is Frank Schumann from University of Illinois, an agronomist who essentially is garlanded by this phrase called nitrogen zindabad. This essentially means long live nitrogen, and you can see how what kind of narrative that they were trying to push in that sense. So this is happening now over the past 10 years in a context in which the agri-tech sector in India is booming. It has already crossed $1 billion in 2021. And even the Indian government is pushing for its promotion through projects like AgriStack, which essentially which was collecting and creating databases of farmers with the help of companies like Microsoft. Here the government will give a unique ID to a farmer, which will allow direct benefit transfers and yield and help them in yield forecasting. And the idea is to increase farmers' income through digital technologies like that. And so in this context, the objective of this paper is firstly to question this narrative of preciseness, right? That data-driven technologies are essentially precise vis-a-vis the quote-unquote guesswork of farmers, the traditional skills of farmers, and how this narrative is not something which is new, which was part of a colonial and post-colonial history of India. And so, we want to push this narrative and placing it in this historical context. So I won't go much into the methodology, but what our aim was to understand, look at both the context in which the technology is developed. So we interviewed people from various companies and startups, agritech startups, as well as we did a participant observation study in the context in which the technology is deployed, which is the sorting and grading machine in a village in the state of Maharashtra in India, as well as we interviewed several farmers to understand what they think of these technologies and how they're using it. So this was the narrative which is pushed by these agritech companies, right? That this is essentially, these decisions cannot be left to an element of guesswork. We need data-driven precision because these in the context in which this is happening is something which is not conducive for the so-called guesswork decision making by farmers. And so one of the major findings from my this study was the fact that precision farming is neither precise nor its precision even useful for those who use it, essentially. So basically, the irony is that the irony is that the agritech companies build their models on the feedback of the same farmers whose skills are deemed as guesswork, but the farmers still feel that their voice is not heard. As you can see, like the idea is that they need the feedback to build these models, but even then the farmers feel that their voice is not being heard. Sometimes the farmers do not actually find that these machines to be precise enough for them, these sensors precise enough for them. The farmers would rather listen to their fellow farmers or the rich dominant farmer who is successful in their own village rather than use the predictions made by these sensors. As you can see, these sensors don't essentially tell these farmers what they actually want. And then in fact, they rely on their own knowledge. They find their own knowledge to be more precise in certain contexts. For instance, in the northern part of the country, there's this festival of Chhat Puja, which is celebrated where where grapes is essentially consumed. Now, while talking to grape farmers in Nasik, what I found was that in order to cater to the demand of this festival, the farmers can't follow the normal cycle of harvest and pruning, and because this festival comes in October and the normal season is in April and March, but the sensors are installed in the farms are developed based on the normal season of harvesting and pruning, and so their recommendations which these sensors and these which they give are not suitable if the farmers want to target the October cycle of grapes. And here you can see that while the farmers and the work that they do is portrayed as something which is not precise, they have a precise schedule of what kind of pesticide they want to use. I saw that they maintain a diary in which they have schedule of how much pesticide on each day they will use. So it is not that what they do is not precise and it's mere guesswork, as the agritech companies would like us to believe. Another problem is that the agritech companies whose product we saw initially in the slide claims that accuracy is needed for targeting export markets. So they say that we need machines which can provide more accurate sorting and grading so that we can sort more accurate, more better quality onions for the export market. And this is something which the human sorting and grading workers cannot do. As you can see how women are sorting and grading onions over here. But if you ask the vendors to whom they sell these machines, these companies are targeting, they don't even want that accuracy because it will lead to more wastage. The machine will sort out onions which can potentially be sorted and graded for domestic markets. So they actually do not even want that kind of an accuracy which the machines can provide, and they actually want little less accuracy, but certainty in terms of less wastage. So even here, the so-called accuracy and precision is not even needed, even if it's there. Sorry. Yeah, finally, what I'd like to say is that the binary created here, which between data decision data-driven farming, data-driven farming versus the guesswork of these farmers. Here devalues the local embedded knowledge which these farmers have, which these machines are not able to essentially, capture and work with. Even when the agri-tech companies seek the feedback, they want it to better their model and not necessarily cater to the concerns of the farmers. So in the end, we need to probably reimagine how we create these data-driven technologies. Historically, from the colonial to the post-colonial times, science and technology has been deemed superior to the local knowledge and the local context. Perhaps it is time that we change that approach. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciated the illustrations that really brought home the onions and the farmers at the heart of the story. So our final paper comes from Alex Campolo, who's at Durham, and Katia Schwerzmann and Ruhr-Universität in Bochum. From is to ought, from rules to examples, machine learning's type of authority. Take it away, my friends.
So yeah, many thanks to everybody for including us in the conference, for coming, and also for reading the paper. So yeah, I'm Alex Campolo. I'm a postdoc on the Algorithmic Societies project at Durham, and I just want to acknowledge the European Research Council, which has supported our stuff. And okay. Yeah, and I'll just say our plan here is to rehearse just the basics of this argument and at the end do a little bit of reflection on the problem of machine learning in relation to the type of social theory that we're kind of aspiring to do. And just for context, what you've read here is an article that's under review from a journal, and this is we're sort of giving a response to our reviewers in this stage, but like your feedback will also can potentially also affect the finished version. So our paper just began by seeing statements like this appear in the machine learning literature. And we were really intrigued by the way that the community seems to have conceptualized a kind of, or at least in this case, a very neat and symmetric reversal from programming with rules to training by examples. And we began with a kind of hypothesis, or even just an intuition, that this perceived change could shed light on deeper questions involving how concepts of rules, examples, algorithms, etc., have changed over time. These in turn, I think, opened onto a whole range of historical, sociological, and ethical issues. The one we chose to pursue was to ask whether, and if so, how, machine learning might entail a specific type of regulation of our conducts governed by operations like classification and prediction, and whether there might be something different happening here than the kind of widely known ideas like calculation, quantification, rationalization that have been used in social theory to describe, kind of modernity at large. So this led us to look for theoretical frameworks that could help us make sense of this supposed transition from a kind of rules to examples-based form of knowledge. And there are tons of candidates. We took a lot of inspiration from Lorraine Daston's recent book on rules. But as we proceeded, we were increasingly drawn to a very old set of ideas from the sociologist Max Weber. In particular, his idea of a rational type of authority gave us a good account of what connects rules and authority. And when we use the term authority in this paper, we use it in this kind of sociological sense, right? It refers to not the raw exercise of power or violence, but rather specific reasons that people follow commands or allow themselves to be governed in certain ways, the legitimacy of rules. And with machine learning, this legitimacy, it could refer to why we accept to be classified or interact with predictive systems in certain ways. So our understanding of programming rules and examples in machine learning is comparative. We wanted to show how a certain understanding of rules emerge in connection with digital computing. And we think this is kind of well known and established. But it's important to rehearse because it gives us a concrete point to try to discern what might be more novel in a type of authority based on examples enacting in machine learning. So of course, as Daston's work shows, the idea of a rule covers a huge amount of historical diversity. And in the past, the ideas of rules and examples very often worked in tandem, actually. Examples illustrate rules. But for our purpose, we focus on this set of Weberian ideas regarding rational rules because we think they form a kernel of a type of authority that was intensified in programming logics, which Daston refers to as sort of thin algorithmic rules that can later be separated analytically from examples.
Foundational work in computer science in the middle of the 20th century linked the technical characteristics of digital programming with questions of rules and authority. This is, for instance, the case of Alan Turing's account of programming rules in his classic paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence. In the paper, Turing described computer rules and their functioning using the language of authority. The definition of programming rules he offers echoes many of the characteristics Weber attributes to rules. However, the technical features of the universal Turing machine, its discrete character and its infinite storage capacity, induce important changes in the nature of rules. Rules become analytic. They are as numerous as necessary to break down complex behaviors into unambiguous steps. Their extreme specificity and the discontinuity between the computer states allow for a total control over the movement from input to output. And that is what leads to what we had in the earlier panel, this idea of determinism that is linked to the rule-based programming paradigm. In our second genealogy, which is this time the genealogy of examples, this genealogy reconstructs the history of the concept of example. Traditionally, an example is a concrete singularity which comprises the essential features of a type. So in a first metaphysical or even theological sense, an example is a concrete individual that embodies a moral ideal, like, for instance, Jesus or a saint. Those are examples that Kant mentions. In a scientific sense, an example is a specimen that expresses all the essential features of a species or a type so that it is representative of the type. And so example can be contrasted to something like single instances or token of a type. While rules tell or prescribe explicitly how something should be or someone should behave, examples show or reveal norms, leaving space for interpretation and implicit knowledge. However, this is not to say that examples have a lesser prescriptive force than rules. The difference is maybe that the subject is left with the difficult task to interpret this norm and the relationship between examples and the norm. As for the rational types of authority, machine learning's what we call exemplary type of authority must appear legitimate to exert its influence. And the legitimacy of this new exemplary type of authority is based on what we call an artificial naturalism. Oh my God. I'm sorry. Let's roll back a little bit. Okay. So I'm coming now to the transformation induced by machine learning in the understanding of example. So machine learning examples are not singularities representative of types anymore. Instead, and it was not easy for us to define what becomes examples in machine learning. We tried to define them that way. They are complex assemblage by which data is aggregated, pluralized through scale, formatted and processed through feature engineering and model, so that norms, also called representations, can emerge from them. The representation produced by machine learning become normative in a dual sense. First, they affect how models will classify new instances by making generalization possible. And second, in a more traditional sense, these norms influence our own behaviors by making possible prediction and classification. So to summarize, while examples in the traditional sense induce obedience through their perfection and their reference to a type, in machine learning, examples induce obedience through the norms they inductively elicit in a, what we have come to define as in a naturalistic way. And that's, I'm coming back to now the way machine learning exemplary type of authority legitimate itself. And it legitimates itself through a kind of artificial naturalism. The expression artificial naturalism can seem contradictory, but it renders the messy tension that characterizes machine learning between a desire to let data speak for itself through models and the engineering practices that permit it to do so. And we think it's a naturalism in the sense that first it presupposes a world determined by deep statistical structures that are inaccessible to human perception and only accessible through representations produced by models. These representations should increasingly be learned from data itself rather than from human specified interventions. The motto being, scale is all you need. The goal is to discover regularities in the data that function as norms, capable of accurately classifying new data in new contexts. So, unlike rules which are transcendent to the order to which they apply, in machine learning, norms and examples are immanent to one another, so that they seem to be one of the same kind. Thus, the representations only seem to express the regularities found in the data.
Okay, and yeah, we'll just end here by sort of reflecting a little bit on some issues that we were kind of thinking about and struggling with while writing this paper. And yeah, so first it's probably obvious, but it's worth saying explicitly that we're kind of attempting to link developments in science and technology with concepts from social seriously. And we take very seriously that this is challenging to do in a kind of convincing way. And we were thinking that like one of the implications of our argument goes against the idea that we must build kind of analytical walls to distinguish technical and colloquial or philosophical senses of notions like bias, training, examples, prediction, and classification. And I think we were thinking that one implication of our argument commits us to a position that it's in fact neither desirable or perhaps not even possible to separate these technical senses from the kind of sedimented ethical and political ramifications, and that technical transformations add new layers to these. We hope that this kind of conceptual historical approach can kind of navigate between a technological determinism and a more, sort of idealistic position, although I think we have to be totally frank that we see our work probably more on the side of the latter. A second point just concerns the scale or scope of the paper, which is big and kind of like epical. So this means that we had to be very selective. So we chose to analyze a very few tendencies or phenomena that we hope can give a kind of analytical grip on our problems. But we also recognize that there are times when the paper goes into some technical detail, and that getting these details right doesn't just matter to us for our own integrity, but they're also related to the theoretical problems. And then just a final point concerns the question of like, what kind of critique are we making? So I think it's worth saying explicitly that we think there are probably some differences between our work and a lot of other very important existing scholarship on AI ethics, where a kind of existing framework is used to identify and hopefully mitigate some concrete harms caused by machine learning. This work is super important, but we just thought that it might be worth saying that we see ourselves doing something a little bit different, which has to do with the way that machine learning makes possible different forms of ethical relationships in the sense of different ways of conducting ourselves and producing or legitimating obedience. And I think it, people could criticize us for saying that that we're kind of relativists, right? That we suspend, in a certain case, we suspend judgment on some of the statements from the machine learning community and instead work in a kind of more analytical mode to try to describe possible contours and effects of this type of authority rather than advocate for or against it. So yeah, we'll just leave it there, and we're sort of welcome to your comments to hear what you think. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. And the last point is, I think, a great jumping off place. So our papers clearly, well, thank you to all four groups. And I think one of the richnesses of this panel is it's actually framed by two pieces which offer a kind of a historical emplotment, a meta-analysis of the development of machine learning in two really important and very pressing case studies. And I think what's characteristic of the papers that we've just seen is that they all take machine learning activity seriously without taking it literally. And what I mean by that is they all are interested in investigating how, in fact, machine learning operates while simultaneously underscoring the gulf with epistemic, marketing, clinical claims, and activity. And I think for our purposes in thinking through what are we doing as the different communities working in this, it shows that we both need, as it were, careful analysis of machine learning and its limits and the powers of data trained on it, and distinct accounts of the hype and claims and institutions built on them that are often not authorized at all by that machine learning. In fact, are often in tension with what are some of the epistemic building blocks of machine learning. So a way to ask about these papers, and I think probably quite a few other papers, is to look at a difference between the sets of inquiries that take the form of, to what extent do we need to nerd harder? Do we need to nerd better? That is, not hype inappropriately, or use better ground truth data. And that's slightly different than the sort of fairness discourse as it exists, but it has a technical side. And all of these papers, I just lost my notes, the machine learning doesn't want me to nerd harder. The other kind of critique, and all of these papers are involved in it too, is we need not to nerd this way at all, right? This is just wrong. Now, what's fascinating about all of the papers is, and I don't mean this in a critical way, is that they all are involved at both of those operations and in different ways, and recognize the ethical, political urgency. And one of the reasons I think machine learning, as it actually is, as opposed to a lot of the glosses on it as AI that would make it just absolutely continuous with other 20th century sort of things and the breaks that all of our speakers are noting, is that machine learning is very much premised on a lot of the epistemic critiques that humanists would have made of strong AI and other sorts of things, as being empirically unsound, as projecting a particular vision of reasoning onto all of humanity, of being incapable of understanding diverse perspectives, of being limited. And yet, for all of that, which is constitutive of machine learning has even a greater hype machine that's of greater political importance. And so I think all of these papers charge us to think both about machine learning in practice and what that means, and different layers of what I'll gloss as kind of hype, and thinking. Now they differ in a way, and I can't get at the texture of all of them. So I'm gonna sort of two big questions that I'm interested in, and I think they're useful for these papers and perhaps for some others, is the first, to ask the authors, plural, to what extent do you see your work as doing two different forms of critique? I gloss them as nerding in different ways. One is a critique that is internal to machine learning and resolution and is open to bettering the very limited form of knowledge or that machine learning claims in a technical sense through, say, better, more representative data and ground truths. And we saw that figures very prominently in the paper on medical AI as a really important one facet of them. The other is better delimited claims that we saw in Grill's paper about not even using accuracy maybe as even rhetorically, but understanding in fact what it is that machine learning claims. We saw that again with the paper on how to accurately talk about compass data, right, in the lesson. So those are that is an internal critique, and that has been part of the way fairness has been instrumentalized in CS. But I think it can go beyond that. The second is the external need for radically different forms of knowledge making and institution building, and this could range all the way from that metric is wrong to metrics are exactly the wrong to more concrete answers like these technological schemes obfuscate the real sources of political inequality. And we see invocations in our authors while also dealing with this other. And then in the last paper, questions about the ethical self-making involved with these forms of knowledge. Now, what I think is interesting is that all of the papers work at different levels between both of these ways. And there's an ethical urgency and an epistemic urgency. And there's I think, a care with not flattening machine learning into something that it's not. That if you read the hype, you might think machine learning is something very different from it is. And I don't know whether this is fair, but in your paper, you recommend, you talk about remaining accuracy, Ferryman and Kane's paper about discussions of ground in Campolo and Schwerzmann. You have this bad, they didn't really talk about this. They just this great discussion in their paper about machine learning and the use of 23andMe data to draw sort of inferences. Whereas the Mishra paper is much more skeptical of data in general, right? It has less of it doesn't say propose that actually we should look at we can build better systems for onions. Now that leads me to ask, to what extent in this conversation does a techno-solutionism defang some of your critiques? What ways do your papers contribute to better technical solution making, and what ways do they reject those? How to think about those levels of your project, because I find they're so rich in their articulation. A second set of questions, I think all of them say, well, there's also a danger of worrying too much about technical solutionism. And in the case, particularly the medical AI paper, really brings out that many of the problems with the medical AI are because they automate pre-existing fundamental algorithmic issues of who has clinical authority and who that clinical authority applies to. And so the problem is that the subjectivity of the ground truth, when automated, amplifies and accelerates. But the ground of critique is at machine learning, but cannot be just machine learning because it's far more fundamental. Okay, I'm not going to go, I've already said way too much. I'm just going to get back to where I began. I think the richness of these papers is, again, looking concretely at what machine learning is in these contexts, and then taking very seriously the inferences, the hype that builds around them. And I'll just list a few, and I won't go into detail, but one is a gap between the modesty that in some sense, the epistemic modesty that's at the heart of machine learning as opposed to old AI, versus the over-promising world of liberation through data, better farming through data. A subjectivity gap in which, again, machine learning is premised on using human subjectivity in many cases as its ground truth. But even in things without ground truth, like training a large language model, that is human data, right? It's precisely it's human-based data. And the last paper really helps us see that. These are connected to other gaps, an inference gap about the gulf between how inferences are presented and what in fact is authorized, a novelty gap, and that was very clear in the paper on farming practices, where the continuities with long-term transformations, the Green Revolution, are very clear, but claims of radical novelty are both false and enormously important in the stories we tell. Above all, there's a kind of hype gap, right? all of these are kind of a hype gap, but we can't just in our operations just strip away the hype and get at the real systems, because hype is part of the real systems. And those are different levels of analysis that I think are really that I commend, and I really learned so much from our speakers in helping me think through those different levels. Okay, I will end there, and if there's anything you want to respond to that, to those questions, go ahead, and I'm sure our audience is extremely good with questions, so we can turn things to you soon.
I have, thank you so much for that, bringing all the connections together. And you really brought up one of the kind of concerns or fears or something that we had as we were, writing this paper, which is of course in, draft form. And so we have more to think through. But one of the things we didn't want our paper to come off as saying is that we want a better ground truth, that we want to tell the FDA, hey, what you have for your ground truth here is bad because it's only based on 3 radiologists. So what you need to do is just make sure you get 10,000 radiologists or 40,000 radiologists, right? Like that is actually not what we are thinking about as the solution, right? Because, for me as an anthropologist, right, like I believe that there is truth in one account, like in a single account, there is truth, and that, within a single account is the truth of the whole world, right? So it's not necessarily about having more numbers or a higher quantity of accounts to make a better ground truth. So I'm really glad that you sort of brought that up, but I think for us, what we are thinking about is the kind of first step is just going back to the idea of sort of hype is just bringing this up and just sort of exposing this, right? So saying that this is how this process is working, right? Like right now, this is how these developers and agencies, and this is what the FDA is accepting as ground truth and to approve or clear these devices, right? And we think there's value in just sort of doing that. And so to the next step of sort of like, well, what do we do next? Or what are our recommendations, or what do we, where we want to go from there? I think the next thing that we're sort of considering is thinking about how that ground truth is operating in different ways. So one, it's establishing this epistemic authority of the tool itself, but it's also establishing the epistemic authority of, yes, these 3 radiologists in the case of Amy Triage. And what is that doing? What does that do when the ground truth for a device is constructed as the knowledge of 3 US radiologists, right? What does that say about how we are thinking of the basis of medical evidence in today, right? That medical, evidence for this particular tool can be based on 3 US based radiologists. And it's sort of like, what kinds of images and longer histories of expertise and knowledge generation and where knowledge comes from and where, privilege to make these kind of pronouncements, right? Like how is just, saying that this is an acceptable ground truth, enacting so many patterns from the past and pushing those things forward into the future. So I think there's part of the sort of like thinking about what that account as ground truth is actually doing in the world is as the second part of why we think it's important to sort of bring this up. So again, not necessarily to say, hey, let's, have more ground truthers, right? And this is the last part, the last thing I say is that, but we also do, right? We neglected to say in our intro, we're both situated at the bioethics, the Berman Institute for Bioethics and the Health Policy and Management Department at Johns Hopkins, right? So we actually do have a great opportunity to be involved with policymakers, right? So with agencies who will come to us and say, great, you found these limitations with our process. What should we do now to make this process better? So there's also that process of like, wanting to think about how to actually operationalize some of these recommendations that we might have for a distinct policy space. So.
I just want to add something to what Kadija just said. I think to insist that a single account can be true is really important. And because what we show in our paper is that asking for more data is actually contributed to the naturalistic claim. The idea that the map could cover the whole territory. So that's just by adding data, we would come closer and closer to the truth. So that is a claim that I think on the basis of our paper, we would question.
Thanks for the summarization and questions. So I think you pointed to important critiques here about improvement and that's what touched upon, and like again delimiting claims. But part of the so I hope this comes out in a newer version of the paper better. But part of the project is also like moving away from, to some degree, from a debate that is centered in sort of a discourse on rationality in some sense, and focus on politics. I mean, that's I think the like I think accuracy is like this gateway towards like ideas around like accuracy itself sounds like, again, like if you make an accuracy claim, like you have this some universal notion, so it comes with these ideas of universality embedded in it to some degree. And I hope with the paper not to make the debate about how do we improve rationality, improve accuracy necessarily, or some notion of accuracy, but again highlight how accuracy is deeply political, and how we need to where machine learning and like this broader discourse needs to engage more with the politics. I mean, I think there's lots of research which is trying to do that. And one danger of like engaging like in the paper like so much with like these technical claims is that it continues, I think, this rationality discourse instead of like moving to questions around politics, which are, I think, central again to testing and deciding on whether something counts as accurate or ground truth.
Do our Zoom. You could ask Kushang if he wants to comment at all.
Yeah, do we have any comments?
Well, specifically,
Yeah, Kushang, did you want to say anything?
Kushang, yeah, did you want to say anything?
No, I think I echo what just Gabriel said, that maybe we don't need to just think about, focus on a technical aspect of it in terms of what will accuracy is, how can we improve accuracy, but essentially talk about whose accuracy are we talking about. I mean, coming from my own example, like the sorting and grading machines for onions, they are accurate for the purpose of exporting those onions to markets in the West, to other countries which can offer that kind of a money. But then what the local onion vendors, what they want essentially is, do we even need that accuracy? Because for us, the market is the domestic market. So are we creating these technologies just to serve a certain quality which can only which only serves a certain market, a certain understanding of what that of who can define what that quality essentially means? And so we need to probably think about the larger political and economic questions as to who are we building these technologies for, essentially. Yeah, so that's my one.
Great. No, I love those answers, and it really makes me think about the way in which papers in this space, generally speaking, can be instrumentalized in ways that we find worrisome, right? That readings that do accord with bits of what we might be doing can be disaggregated from larger other kinds of critiques. Okay, I think at this point we should open it up to the floor, given the quality of the questions that we've been having, and then to the Zoom. So let's begin with the floor, and then we'll go to the Zoom.
I'll introduce myself. I'm David Stark, sociology at Columbia. These are three, I'm going to talk comments on each of these three things, which it's a pity we don't have a half hour for each one of them. The problem of having three great papers and want to make comments is that the comments, you had problems doing it in 12 minutes. The comments have to be extremely cryptic. Okay. So starting with Gabriel, my question to you is, under what circumstances in the problem of machine learning does efficacy depend on accuracy? Okay, so you mentioned you want to contribute to the new sociology of testing. So Norcha Mars and I just recently edited this special issue of British Journal of Sociology. And one of the things we are seeing in the new sociology of testing is, in a way, a kind of move from thinking about the test results to thinking about the results of the test. And a key paper for us in that volume is this wonderful paper by Joan Robinson on the home pregnancy test. And what she does in that paper is think about what is the result of the test. So how is it that the test has results for the social relations of the woman who just got tested? And she has all kinds of examples. Great research behind it. So how does it affect the relation to the father, to the mother-in-law, to the swimming coach, and other things? By the way, she has a prior paper about the testing of the medical device at the FDA, in which a critical thing was that a judge ruled that pregnancy was not a disease, which is important. Okay, that moves us to FDA and Kadija and Odia. So my question to you is, it's a kind of thought experiment about a 2x2 table in which you have accuracy and explainability. And both could be either positive or negative. So like, what matters? If they're both positive, like you have accuracy and explainability, like when does that matter? Could you get away and have efficacy with neither accuracy nor explainability? Or under what circumstances could you have like low explainability, but high accuracy? Right? Again, or low accuracy, but high explainability. And like, how would that work in different kinds of settings and problems in even just, for example, the medical field? I think there's something there. You had three things. I forgot that. I remembered accurate. You called it ground truth and accountability. I called it accuracy and explainability. But I think there's really something there. Okay, so for Alex and Katia, super cryptic. I love this paper very, very much. I think it's so interesting. But to you, think about a set of oppositions, and I'm going to give you three, and then wondering like, how does rules and examples fit into that or not? And it's something to spark some thinking. So the first, risk versus uncertainty. So in economic sociology, there is this idea of Knightian uncertainty, which is not a situation of risk where there is calculability. Somehow the future can be seen in some kind of probabilistic terms. And Knight says, the economist Frank Knight, uncertainty is a situation where all bets are off. Like we can't assign probabilities to the future. Okay, but that was just, so risk, uncertainty, calculation, judgment. You can kind of see how that sets up. There's another, confidence and trust, which are not the same. I can assign a confidence interval to something. I can be high or low, but trust is, so you see how these kind of line up: uncertainty, judgment, trust, confidence, and then rules, examples. So does it fit in those, and how? And I love the idea of this indexical, the pointing, the showing as opposed to the telling. And we would have to talk all afternoon about Weber's 3 types of legitimacy in your 4th, but it's really great. Thank you.
So I want to jump on one of these couple of opposites that to me is really fundamental when we think about machine learning and algorithm. It's the opposition between calculation and judgment. And the necessity to reintroduce this difference. A judgment is not reducible to a calculation because it entails an interpretation. And so I think that machine learning may present itself as a pure computation, but we know that judgment enters in many ways at different moments in the process. I think an issue is in the genealogy that the current development of machine learning, there is this desire to move away from judgment and to use scaling, so data and models, and to present it as a way away from judgment, as pure computation, as if that would be possible. And I think it is not, and I think it's a very problematic claim that goes in the direction of this kind of naturalism that we point out.
Yeah, maybe I could just add one thing. I think the calculation of judgments is interesting. Like, I could just speak for myself, you know, maybe not Katia, but like I was also interested. Like the Daston work on rules, I see as like her project is kind of implicitly is a desire to reintroduce judgment into rules. You know, I think like she sort of is not happy with the kind of algorithmic sense of thin algorithmic rules that we have here. And I guess one possibility maybe that our paper sort of raises is like we have to think about judgments differently. Like the first one someone in the first panel talked about model selection, and we talk about like all these kind of like normative things that have to happen for data to be turned into examples. So maybe we look at judgments and calculation not as a binary, but as this sort of like messily assembled sort of thing. I think another way we could think about it too is this like predictability too, which I think has to do with calculation too. So like predictability in the kind of programming paradigm had to do with this deterministic relationship between binary output states. You know, theoretically, not much can go wrong there. Whereas here we see like a much more, I don't even know how to describe it if we do it well, but like ways to associate inputs and output states in this more kind of like stochastic, but still like very powerful way. You know, I'm still kind of grappling with this sort of like forms of predictability type thing. So yeah.
And just a last remark, I think what you say about external and internal critique at the beginning was was one of the difficulty for us, because all the time we have to weigh between what the computer scientists tell they are doing, what we think they are doing, what the technology is actually doing, and all that points in slightly different directions. And so that is one of the difficulty, and it's very messy. I think you use a correct word here.
And I'll take the stab at the question that you asked in terms of what matters most, accuracy or explainability. I mean, my reflex says explainability, but then I harken back to one of the key questions that we had in our paper towards the end, which is how will the commonplace use of medical AI influence our account of biomedical practices, like research and health expertise, as well as practices. And I think that's something critical that we kind of miss out when we talk about medical AI and just the tools themselves, is when they are actually used in practice on patients, and what that dynamic between a physician or specialist and their patient might be. And explainability and communication is critical in that sense. So yes, patients obviously want accurate results and they want accurate answers, but above all, they want to know what's going on. And there's one, you can say that your algorithm is right, but your algorithm explaining why it's right, or more importantly, why it might be wrong, is really critical in the discussion that we need to have about accounts, because there is this preference. There's also this reflex when we talk about quantifiable measures to just rely on those numbers and those results. And we talked on this panel at length of how this idea of accuracy is murky in general. So being able to explain, whether it's the algorithm, whether it's the people who work with the algorithm, what these outputs are and what they mean, especially when we are dealing with patients, and there are some algorithms that go as far as to diagnose certain cancers, that's going to be super critical to disentangle.
Thanks for the question. When I talk about accuracy, then I mean a specific expert discourse to some degree, which also influences, right, sort of policy, public understanding, which sort of like flows into all these different areas. And efficacy is something which I understand is situated. And in the paper, I discuss a bit more how. I had like one slide, rethinking accuracy, which was very short, a bit more how other fields beyond machine learning have sort of dealt with issues around accuracy and efficacy, and how it would be important for machine learning as a discipline to learn from those fields. So I think there are fields who have figured this out much better than machine learning, where we are again in this, one just needs to look on Twitter, where people post accuracy, accuracy numbers. Now with ChatGPT, like they post like a bunch of benchmarks and say, look, our model is this great, and then people are like questioning that because they're saying the benchmark. So it's sort of like back and forth. I think there are sort of ways that could be taken to make accuracy more useful, and correspond more to like like sort of a stronger correspondence to sort of efficacy in some sense. But no matter the case, or no matter if accuracy works or not, but it has these right social effects, as you also discuss, and is performative, and that's really important to always consider.
Aaron, we are at the end of our time. Do you want to call it now or leave room for another couple minutes?
That's a great question.
There's clearly a lot.
There's a lot.
I mean, I could talk about each paper for like 3 hours, but you don't need that. I have 90 slides if you have time.
If Kushang wants to add anything.
Yes.
And there was one question. Could you ask, is it super fast?
Yeah, I can be really quick.
Okay, so
Kushang, do you want to say anything in response to the previous question before we take the last question?
No, thank you.
Okay.
You can take the next question.
Just making sure. Okay.
please.
Okay, I'll try to be really brief. I have a few questions for several of the panelists. So my name is Kadija. I'm a PhD student at Harvard in STS. So that's where my kind of questions.
The mic is off. All right.
Choose this one.
Thank you. I was just saying I'm a PhD student in STS, Science and Technology Studies. So that's sort of where my questions are coming from. My question to Kadija and Odia are, I was really interested in kind of the way you spoke about epistemic authority and the way it changes what medical evidence is. I was wondering what you think the sort of ontological payoffs of that is. So now that medical evidence has been reshaped by AI, what does it do to kind of what it means to provide good healthcare or good medical advice? Does it sort of reconstitute what it means to be a patient or a doctor, and the kind of relationship of of what good healthcare and good medical advice means. My question to Kushang also, thanks for such a good presentation online. I know it's very difficult to do. My question to you is, you emphasized at several points how there are differences in the kind of needs and advice that farmers give to themselves and to their friends, and the way in which these agri-tech companies provide advice. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the political economy dimensions of it. Sort of how is it that needs for generating capital and profit are intertwined with the kind of advice that these companies are able to give, or the kind of modeling practices they have. So the implications of their need to build capital on the kind of modeling in AI that is possible. And finally, to Alexandra and Katia, thank you again. My question is to do actually with just the very last point, Alexander, that you made about kind of ethical frameworks. So you brought up, of course, Kant and Descartes and other really influential ethicists. A lot of their work can be read through the lens of ethics. I was wondering how you think the kind of ethical problems themselves are being reshaped through AI. So not so much technological solutions, but the kind of ethical problems that one makes up. How is that different from earlier paradigms? Thank you.
Can I go first?
Yeah, Kushang, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. So in terms of the political economy, the way these algorithms are built, not just in India, but across the world is, these agri-tech companies, they cater to larger farms, and to certain kinds of crops. So for instance, certain cash crops like grapes, etc., are catered to, which are, more profitable in that sense, as compared to, let's say, a wheat or a rice, which a small farmer usually grows. Secondly, in terms of the kind of farmers that they target as of now, they mostly target farmers, and even the interviews that I had with farmers, the main interviews were with farmers who can actually afford to have these kind of sensors installed, and even they themselves feel that these sensors, they do not really provide the kind of advice that we require. But yeah, in terms of the political economy of the kind of agri-tech system that is coming up in India, it is largely towards more larger farms, farmers who have more money, and towards crops who are cash crops, which can generate the kind of money. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. So as regard to this question of ethics, it's a complicated one, and we're probably not so precise. But I think that the general impetus of our paper is that we understand ethics here, like less in the position that like we want to say this is good or bad, or certain people should like do this or do that, and rather to ask questions like, how do these techniques make different ways of regulating human conducts possible? What are the kind of what effects do these are these likely to have? So again, like I certainly understand if people aren't satisfied with this and say, why don't you take a position or this? But what I would hope is that with these kind of analytical tools, then other like you could sort of like build more convincing normative positions on top of those. So I'd say it's a sort of sociological approach to ethics, or like a Foucauldian kind of like techniques of the self or conduct of conducts, that type of thing.
Yeah, and so we mentioned Descartes and Kant and Weber in the context of our genealogy, that meaning that we are not relying necessarily on them to provide categories and allowing us to judge these technologies nowadays. I think we need other frameworks, because the categories are transformed by the technology. So and the critical dimension, our position, I think, are pretty clear, but we think that we are going to develop it in further paper here it's like a more general framework.
Thank you so much for that question. And, a couple of things. So, when thinking about the sort of ontology of healthcare and what it means to be a physician and what it means to be a patient in the context of, ever increasing development and use of medical AI tools, I think that we talk more about it in the paper, and we mentioned in the presentation that we're trying to work through this idea of the algorithmic account that was proposed that sort of has these two senses, right? Of like an account of something and being able to be open to an accounting. And in that paper, they give an example of the introduction of AI to transportation security, right? So people who typically, it's like security personnel who typically at airports and railway stations who look at tons and tons of videos, and bringing an AI into that space to help essentially kind of triage, instead of them having to look at hundreds of screens or a bunch of images all the time, that the AI would sort of predict and flag for them suspicious images, right? So, and what was interesting about that account and or that description of the AI being used in that space and how I relate it to the medical space is that, and this is something we neglected to kind of talk about either in the paper or the presentation, is that within medical AI, AI used in radiology is actually deemed highly accurate, so accurate that it has incited fears that radiologists will lose their jobs, because AI in radiology is so accurate, and there have been, tests showing that AI is, more accurate than human radiologists. So there's sort of this context, this background context of like, are human radiologists going to lose their jobs to AI? And part of what we are trying to sort of think through by thinking about this idea of an account is that with a tool like AMI Triage, right, AI MI Triage, is it just like the security advisors? Because what Nayland argues in that account is that it's not that using this tool, it's shifting the way those security folks interact with. So instead of looking at a ton of data and then trying to pinpoint, they get a smaller amount of data, but then they actually usually, when they're presented with something that's flagged as suspicious, they ask for more. They can ask the tool for more background and more images, right? So the argument there is that it's not sort of putting this AI in this space, is not putting security people out of a job because it can flag suspicious bags in an airport. It's just having them do their jobs in a different way. And so that's what we're thinking about in terms of some of these AI tools in radiology. Maybe it's not that it's going to put radiologists out of business, but the way that they interact with sources of data in the way they do their jobs will be shaped and will be different because of the AI. So I think for me, that's one way of getting to your question of sort of what is the ontology of these things? Like, what does it mean to be a radiologist now? And how is that going to be different with the introduction of, these kinds of tools? And I think it remains to be seen, right? And I don't know. I don't think that these, tools will put radiologists out of business, if you will, but it will sort of change the way that they're interacting with data, with information, with patients, et cetera. The other important issue too is, and it also ties back to epistemic authority, is sort of thinking about what counts as evidence. And in some ways, right, we can see the way that these tools are sort of enshrining a particular set of US-based medical expertise as the expertise, right, as the ground truth for these tools. But there's also some really interesting work in computer science, especially when these tools fail or when they kind of break or are brittle, where computer science researchers are sort of looking back and seeing why they do it, and are able to sort of test with different inputs, if you will. And so there's a great article where an AI that was trained using physicians' expertise did not work well, sort of had an overall accuracy rate, but then when you looked at it across demographic groups, it did not work well for certain marginalized demographic groups, racial and ethnic minoritized groups. And they said, well, how about we actually sort of not try to get better ground truth and get more data, more representative data? Why don't we actually not train this model using data from physicians at all? Why don't we use patients' reports on pain? And this was a study about knee pain and images in the knee. And when they trained their model using patient-reported data, those gaps that they saw between groups kind of shrunk, right? So I think it's actually providing, there are some openings for where there is a possibility for epistemic authority to be reshaped as well as these tools are being developed more and then are breaking in practice, as Odia was saying, right? Like so much of how we need to think about these things is how they're actually working and when they're implemented. And so there is, I think, an opportunity when they are used and then they break to say, well, let's actually think critically about what we're enshrining here as epistemic authority, and can we use something else? Can we like totally think of something else as our, ground truth for expertise?
I think we can genuinely say that all 4 papers are something to greatly look forward to think differently with. So let's thank all of our presenters, both present and virtual. Thank you, Kushang, for joining us.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
So I'll see you all.